in this video, I want to start a new series of videos. As you've probably seen so far, I've talked a little bit about various different authors that discuss postmodern philosophy, that discuss post-structuralism, and also different interpretations of those authors. And so I'm going to start another one of those series today. Today I really want to start talking about Black Baudrillard and really to start talking about what Black Baudrillard is, what the interpretation of Baudrillard means, and like how does that kind of define some of the arguments that will be made about Black Baudrillard and the way that will kind of guide our conversations about Black Baudrillard going into like kind of the rest of the conversations that I kind of want to do on this series. I think that Black Baudrillard is a really interesting argument because I think that it's a really interesting take on Baudrillard that, like kind of Dark Deleuze, really contextualizes a lot of the claims that are being made to a lot of the history that applies directly to things that I think people see all around them. And John Dennis Gillespie, I think, is extremely good personally at being able to write about like experiences that are very identifiable and being able to particularly talk about the ways in which the kind of like everyday lived experience of various people that kind of like are in line with or are entangled with anti-blackness in some way are kind of like produced by like this larger system within signs, symbols, etc. And a lot of this will really draw on some of the conversation that we've been having about Baudrillard before. So if you haven't, definitely go look at some of the series, even if it's just the intro or the first couple of videos that I've done talking about Baudrillard as a whole, because I think that some of the notes that I had from there and some of the ideas that I talked about within there will definitely be helpful for some of the stuff that I want to talk about here. In terms of just like breaking down Black Baudrillard and thinking about like who is John Dennis Gillespie, I think that it's really interesting because John Dennis Gillespie is an author that is from the kind of like Maryland area and the Pennsylvania area, and then moved and is now a grad student, PhD student at the University of Irvine, and wrote a lot of really interesting pieces about the way in which we can kind of like reinterpret some of the way that Baudrillard is really writing about like signs, simulacra, and sign value, and is really writing about that in the context of what that means when it really takes on the full weight of something closer to like pessimism or something closer to just thinking really concurrently with anti-blackness in order to really make a lot of Deleuze's theory make sense. And so in this video, hopefully I kind of be able to break down some of these central arguments, talk about a couple ways that it's used on the affirmative and the negative, and maybe some uses that I think it could have on the water resolution in terms of how we kind of begin maybe some of our conversations that'll follow up this video in terms of like how to better execute the strategy on the negative, how to respond to it, and how to execute it on the affirmative. I think that when you're thinking about what are some of the kind of the most central arguments that Black Baudrillard is really making in the context of debate and what are really the most pertinent ones, I think Gillespie's arguments are really about the way in which sign value is drawn from the way in which we think about anti-blackness, and how anti-blackness kind of operates as this structuring system that defines the way in which we kind of relate ourselves to like signs and value, that the ability to kind of like communicate, the ability to kind of like use representation as a medium is foreclosed because of the way in which blackness is prescribed via pathology. And from here, Gillespie is really starting to take pessimism to talk about how like sign and symbol value is not just created out of a desire to like think about the securitization of capital or in order to like maintain the status quo. It is meant to kind of like securitize a certain relationship that binds blackness to death. Gillespie is really interested in like writing about the way in which various kind of conceptions of blackness that rely on it as like a deathly conception are ones in which kind of like currently kind of assign the place of blackness as something that is always kind of like in militancy and against the civil society, but also as something that is kind of positioned as like the necessary sacrifice in order for the continuance of like civil society as it is. And so a lot of the arguments that Gillespie is making is about the way in which the kind of re-representation of death and kind of the use of kind of like a revolutionary terrorism is one that would kind of like change the function of how we think about the relationship that we have towards the kind of creation of like symbolization, sign value, etc. I think that this is particularly interesting because I think the arguments that are being made about the particular kind of way of being able to like really think through what it would look like to take up like a black terrorism is like a really interesting question that guides a lot of the methodology stuff, affirmative and negative, from what Gillespie is doing. And I think it's a really interesting place to kind of like start off maybe some of this conversation. I think that when I'm thinking about some of the main ways to use Black Baudrillard on the affirmative, I'm really thinking about ways that I can find interesting routes in order to create really cool articulations of like what this type of like example of like terrorism looks like, how symbolic terrorism works. A lot of the questions and things that I see people stumbling on is like, how should we feel about like the kind of like invocation of like literal versus metaphorical as like how we think about the methodology. And I think that it's really just a question of your ability to cite and use examples that are really like bringing together ways that you can kind of explain your method beyond just like the metaphorical or theoretical uses of such a system. Because I think that thinking about it as a form that both takes up the way that people perform and think about debate, but also thinking about it as something that is way beyond that and that goes into like everyday practice that Gillespie is really talking about when he's speaking about the experiences of activists in places like Baltimore and other places where like resistance shows up, and really thinking about the symbolic value of like what it means to like put oneself on the line. I thought it's always been really interesting to try to like read maybe some of the stuff that Gillespie is saying with the idea of revolutionary suicide that comes from like Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party and like that kind of like vein of literature. And I definitely think that is a good route in order for you to really realize the kind of like commitment that is being like asked in order to really think about what type of ethic we could take up in order to disarticulate the current way in which we kind of think about and articulate like the legibility of blackness when like it is like attempted to be rendered legible. I think that when I'm thinking about what are the main uses of the negative, I really like the way Black Baudrillard really plays into a lot of impact calculus. As somebody that both read this strategy and has seen it executed a bunch of times and has coached people on it, I really think that being able to go all in and really outframe the other team and just like why the relationship they have to debate and towards the way in which they kind of justify their affirmative is like really the best place for like where you want to take the negative, because I think there are really interesting and good critiques that Gillespie is really bringing out about the way in which we kind of attach ourselves to like a certain particular relationship to life and death that requires us to kind of position blackness as something outside of civil society. And I really think kind of like taking the opportunity of reading Black Baudrillard to really dive into questions of how people are framing their impacts and using them to justify their affirmative can definitely short circuit a lot of the like kind of like more impact outweigh argument that teams are like really trying to rely on or to be criticisms like this, especially when they're thinking about how they could debate Baudrillard proper instead of this particular type of argument. And so I think really keeping in mind the ability for you to kind of like use this as a negative strategy that starts with your ability to like frame them more out of the debate and kind of take a more offensive approach to the form of the AF, that can kind of help you set your priorities in terms of what types of arguments you should focus on, which I think is similar to some of the stuff that I kind of talked about when I began like the Baudrillard lecture proper. I think when I'm thinking about maybe some of the uses of Black Baudrillard on the water topic, I definitely think that when we talk about things like resource scarcity, when we talk about things like water quality, there's so many times where blackness is kind of used as a stand-in to talk about like marginalized communities that are kind of like stripped of resources, agency, etc. And there are various ways that that kind of like suffering image is used and passed around in order to make legible certain policies or to make them seem desirable. And in that sense, I think there's a really good angle for Black Baudrillard to critique both really soft left affirmatives and affirmatives that are definitely in the area of just like existential crises. But I also think affirmative, there are some really interesting ways to think about the radical ways in which various activists put themselves on the line in order to think about things like climate activism, like doing things like resource distribution. And so I think that kind of investigating a lot of these things about thinking about alternative ways that communities put themselves on the line in order to rethink about the kind of commitment that we have in order to thinking about water distribution and the way that water scarcity is dealt with could be a really interesting way in order to get an affirmative in route on this topic. Hopefully this video was helpful for you in order to get a starter intro into thinking about Black Baudrillard, and hopefully you'll tune in for the rest of it. Thanks.